The judge held my grandmother's handwriting between two fingers like it might still be warm. And the whole courtroom went the kind of quiet where you can hear the radiator complaining in the wall. 23 people were sitting behind me in that gallery. Neighbors, my brother's golf buddies, a woman from the diner who used to slip my grandmother extra pie. And every single one of them was about to find out who I actually was. My name is Ren, and 11 months before that morning, my own brother and sister stood in my grandmother's kitchen and called me a freeloader to my face for the crime of being the one who stayed. "You didn't move in to help her," my sister Nicole said, arms crossed, not even lowering her voice. "You moved in because you had nowhere else to go." I didn't answer her that day. I just kept folding the towel in my hand, the way you learn to fold a hospital sheet so the corners never come loose, and I let her believe whatever made her sleep at night. What none of them knew, what I didn't fully understand myself until 3 weeks before that hearing, was that my grandmother had spent the last clear year of her life writing everything down. Not for herself, for a fight she somehow already knew was coming, long after she wouldn't be in the room to see it. I'm Ren. If you're new here, this is where I tell you what happens when the people who are supposed to love you the most decide, quietly, in a kitchen or over a phone call, that you're worth less than the furniture. And what happens when somebody finally has to answer for it. I promise you the ending. Stick around for it, because it's the only part of this story I'm proud of. And if you've ever been the one who stayed while everyone else found a reason to disappear, go ahead and subscribe before we go back to the beginning. You're going to want to remember exactly where this started. Let me take you back. Not to the hearing, further than that. Back to Millhaven, Vermont, population a little over 4,000. Where the same radiator in my grandmother's kitchen clanked its one complaint every winter for 40 years. And where I was 8 years old the first time I learned exactly how my family did math. It started with a funeral. It usually does. My father died when I was 8, Wesley was 16, and Nicole was 13. A truck came around the curve on Route 9 too fast in October, and after that, our house smelled like other people's casseroles for 2 dishes nobody was really eating, going soft in the fridge because grief doesn't leave room for appetite. I remember the smell of a tuna bake that sat on the counter for 4 days. I still can't eat tuna. That smell is still the smell of the day my family split itself into 2 kinds of people, the ones who got taken care of and the one who learned to take care of herself. Grandma Jo came the second the phone rang. She drove through the night in her old station wagon and walked into our kitchen, still wearing her nightgown under her coat. And the first thing she did wasn't cry. It was open the refrigerator, take stock of what was in it, and start making a list of what the house would need for the week. I didn't understand yet that this was how she loved people, quietly, with her hands in the middle of the worst thing that had ever happened to us. I just knew that as long as she was standing at that counter, the house felt like it might survive. My mother didn't get out of bed most days that first month. Nobody blamed her for it. But somebody still had to sign for the casket and call the insurance company and figure out which bills were due before the next paycheck that wasn't coming. Wesley started answering the phone on the second ring, using a voice I'd never heard him use before. Flatter and older, a voice that made strangers on the other end assume they were talking to an adult. The life insurance check came about 6 weeks later. $31,000, which felt to an 8-year-old like more money than existed in the whole state of Vermont. My mother could barely get out of bed some mornings that winter, so somebody had to be the one who talked about the check, the funeral bills, the mortgage. Wesley decided that somebody was him. I wasn't supposed to hear the conversation. I was sitting on the floor outside the kitchen, drawing on the back of a church bulletin, close enough to the heating vent that voices came up through the floor like they were standing right next to me. My mother's voice, thin and tired, asking Wesley why he'd gone ahead and moved money into an account with just his name on it. And then my brother's voice, 16 years old, and already sounding like a man twice that age, already sounding like someone who'd rehearsed this, said the sentence I would hear again twice more before I turned 32, both times right before he cost me something. "I don't take from this family," he said. "I manage it." I didn't understand it then. I just knew it was the kind of sentence that ended arguments instead of starting them, the kind adults said when they wanted you to stop asking questions and start being grateful. Grandma Jo drove up from 2 towns over within the week. She didn't argue with Wesley about the account. She told me later that some fights aren't worth having with a 16-year-old who's scared and trying to be the man of the house, and that you save your strength for the fights that actually matter. Instead, she did something quieter. She took me to the bank with her, just the two of us, and opened a small savings account in my name. $12 to start it, funded a little more every birthday after that. I didn't understand what guardianship paperwork was. I didn't understand what it meant that she'd had a notary in the room, or why she'd asked the teller twice to make sure everything was signed correctly. I just remember her crouching down in the parking lot afterward, still in her church coat, cupping my face in both hands. "Don't worry, baby," she said. "I made sure you're witnessed." I thought she meant seen. I was 8. I thought it meant somebody had watched me get a savings account, the way you'd want somebody to watch you do something you were proud of. It would be 24 years before I understood it was a legal word, and that my grandmother had just quietly made sure that whatever happened to the rest of the money in this family, there would always be a paper trail proving I existed and that someone had chosen me on purpose. Nobody explained any of that to an 8-year-old. Nobody had to. Kids don't need the vocabulary to feel the temperature of a room. And the temperature of my house after that October was that Wesley managed things. Nicole got noticed, and I got fed, clothed, sent to school, and mostly overlooked, the reliable, quiet kid who didn't need anything, so nobody thought to check. Grandma Jo used to say she'd been taking care of dying people since before it was something you got a license for. She'd worked as a home health aide in the 70s, back when the job meant showing up to a stranger's house with nothing but a bag of clean linens and good instincts. And she never really stopped being that person, even after she married my grandfather and started a family of her own. Summers, I stayed with her. Not because anyone decided it was the best arrangement for me, because nobody else asked. Wesley had football and later community college. Nicole had friends whose parents had swimming pools. I had Grandma Jo's kitchen, and a recipe box that had been in her family longer than the house had been in ours, and long, unhurried afternoons where the biggest event of the day was whether the bread proofed right. She taught me to fold hospital corners on a bedsheet before I ever set foot in a hospital. She taught me to check the color of somebody's lips without making them feel like a patient. She taught me that you could tell more about how a person was really doing by watching their hands than by asking them how they felt. Because hands don't know how to perform for company the way a voice does. People will tell you they're fine right up until the moment they're not, she told me once, elbow deep in bread dough, not even looking up. Your job isn't to believe the fine. Your job is to watch the hands. I didn't know yet that she was training me for a career. I thought she was just keeping me busy. She took me with her once, the summer I was 11, to check on a neighbor down the road, a widower named Mr. Abernathy, who'd broken his hip and had nobody local to look in on him. I sat on his porch step while she made him tea he didn't really want and asked him 3 questions about his week that sounded like small talk but weren't. On the drive home, she told me his daughter had called twice that week saying everything was fine and that his daughter was wrong and that Grandma Jo already had the number for a visiting nurse in her purse before we'd even pulled out of his driveway. "How did you know she was wrong?" I asked her. "His hands were shaking when he poured his own tea," she said. His daughter's 3 states away. She's not wrong because she's a bad daughter. She's wrong because she's not in the room. You can't manage somebody's life over the phone, baby. You can only manage it in the room with your eyes open. I didn't know it yet, but she'd just described, almost exactly, the difference between the kind of caretaking that actually costs you something and the kind that just sounds good in a phone call. It would take me another 20 years to watch someone in my own family prove her right. The recipe box sat on the counter her whole life, dented at one corner from a move in 1974, packed with index cards and handwriting that got shakier every decade, her mother's slanted cursive on the oldest ones, her own rounder print on top of that. She made me copy recipes out by hand instead of just memorizing them. Insisted every card get written down exact, measurements and all. No shortcuts. "Why do I have to write it down if you're right here to tell me?" I asked her once. Maybe 10 years old, bored, wanting to go outside. She stopped kneading long enough to look at me. "Write it down, baby," she said. Paper remembers what people forget. I wrote down 41 recipes that summer. I still have every one of them. I didn't understand at 10 years old that my grandmother wasn't really talking about stew. By the time I was in high school, the caretaking had become instinct instead of a lesson. I was the kid who noticed when a substitute, the kid who could tell a classmate was about to have a panic attack before they knew it themselves. Guidance counselors called it emotional intelligence. Grandma Jo just called it having been raised right by somebody who paid attention, which was her polite way of saying she'd raised me, in all the ways that counted, more than my own house had. I got into the nursing program at the State University on a partial scholarship the same spring Wesley got engaged and Nicole got her first real apartment in Burlington. Nobody threw me a party. Grandma Jo drove 3 hours round trip to take me to a diner and order me a slice of pie the size of my head. And she told me, in the same flat, certain voice she used for everything that mattered to her, that I was going to be exactly the kind of nurse people wished they'd had sooner. "You already know how to watch the hands," she said. "The rest is just paperwork." I didn't know then how much paperwork would end up mattering. Neither of us did. Or maybe she did and she just didn't say it yet. By the time I was 29, I had exactly the kind of life nobody makes a documentary about, and I liked it that way. A 1-bedroom apartment and bar, with a radiator that worked better than the one from my childhood kitchen. A job on the geriatric floor at Central Vermont Medical. A shift schedule I'd fought hard to get. And a quiet, steady competence that patients' families noticed even when my own family didn't. Geriatric nursing isn't glamorous. Nobody puts it on a recruitment poster. You spend your days with people whose bodies are failing faster than their minds, or whose minds are failing faster than their bodies. And you learn to read pain in people who've stopped being able to describe it accurately. You learn who shows up during visiting hours because they love someone, and who shows up because they're worried about a house. I had a patient that year, an old man named Mr. Fenwick, whose son flew in from Arizona twice a year and told every nurse on the floor how devoted he was to his father, loud enough for the whole hallway to hear it. I noticed the way you notice things when watching hands is your whole job. That Mr. Fenwick's fingernails were never trimmed except by us. That his son never once stayed past visiting hours to help him eat, and that the son always left holding a folder of paperwork instead of his father's hand. Nobody else on the floor thought much of it. I filed it away anyway, the same way Grandma Jo had taught me to file things away, not to accuse anyone of anything, just to notice, because noticing is free, and it costs you nothing to be right later. I saw Grandma Jo most weekends. She still lived alone in the house in Millhaven, still kept the recipe box on the counter, still made me copy out a new card every visit like it was homework. But somewhere around her 78th birthday, I started noticing things a stranger might have missed and a nurse couldn't. She told me the same story. about her sister twice in one afternoon, word for word, like she was reading it off a card in her head. She left a pot of soup on a lit burner and didn't remember doing it. Once she called me by my mother's name and then looked so frightened by her own mistake that I had to sit with her on the porch steps for 20 minutes before her breathing evened out. I mentioned it to Wesley on the phone. He told me she was just getting older, same as everybody, and changed the subject to a fishing trip he'd taken his daughter Kylie on that weekend. I didn't know yet that he'd already had Grandma Jo sign a power of attorney document 8 months earlier, in a lawyer's office in Montpelier, with Nicole as a witness and nobody thinking to mention it to me. I found out about the power of attorney by accident, the way you find out about most things in a family that doesn't tell you things on purpose. Grandma Jo mentioned, offhand, over pie, that Wesley had started handling the bills so I don't have to fuss with them. She said it like it was a kindness. I remember feeling a small, cold drop of unease in my stomach and not knowing exactly why, the way you feel a draft in a house before you find the open window. I didn't push it. I told myself Wesley was the oldest, the responsible one, the one who'd learned to manage things back when he was 16. I told myself that was just how our family worked. It took me another 8 months and a diagnosis before I understood how expensive that assumption was going to be. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday in March, in a small beige office that smelled like hand sanitizer, from a neurologist who used the words moderate stage vascular dementia the same way you'd read a grocery list, because he said them 15 times a week and had stopped hearing how much weight they carried the first time a family heard them. Grandma Jo sat very still in the exam chair, hands folded in her lap, the way she'd taught me to fold mine when a doctor was giving somebody news, and asked exactly one question. "Will I still know my own kitchen?" The doctor said gently that it depended on the progression and that a stable, familiar environment with consistent caregivers made an enormous difference in how gracefully the disease moved. Consistent caregivers. I remember writing that phrase down on the back of an appointment card, underlining it twice, the way she'd taught me to underline the important things. We had the family meeting 2 weeks later, around her kitchen table, under the same light fixture that had hung there since before my father died. Wesley drove up from Montpelier. Nicole came from Burlington, 20 minutes late, still in her work blazer. I brought a legal pad because somebody needed to write things down, and old habits die hard. I said I would move in. I said it before anyone else offered anything, because in 11 seconds of silence around that table, I understood that if I didn't say it, nobody was going to. I gave notice on my apartment and bar. I dropped to part-time at the hospital, which meant losing my health insurance and picking up a much worse plan through the marketplace. I moved into my father's old childhood bedroom in my grandmother's house, in a town of 4,000 people at 29 years old, to spend the next 3 years doing, unpaid, the exact job I already did for strangers at the hospital every day. Except now, the person whose hands I was watching was the woman who'd taught me how to watch hands in the first place. Wesley said it was incredibly generous of me. He said it once, at that table, and then he never mentioned it again in a way that suggested he actually thought about what it cost. Nicole visited on holidays, mostly, and posted photographs of those visits with captions about how much she treasured time with Grandma. She was there for maybe 6 days a year, total, across 3 years. I did the math once, on a bad night. Because doing math is a thing you learn to do quietly when you're the kind of person nobody else is keeping track of. It was at Thanksgiving, 14 months into the arrangement, that Nicole said it. Grandma Jo was having a good day, alert enough to sit at the table for the whole meal. And I'd spent 6 hours cooking a dinner from recipe cards written in 3 generations of handwriting. Nicole had brought a store-bought pie, and a bottle of wine, and somewhere between the turkey and the dishes, in the kitchen, with the water running, she said it. "You didn't move in to help her," she said. "You moved in because you had nowhere else to go. Let's be honest, Ren, you've been living here rent-free for over a year." People are starting to talk. I stood at the sink with soap up to my wrists, and I didn't say anything for a long moment. I thought about the apartment I'd given up, the insurance I'd lost, the 12-hour days that started with helping Grandma Jo get dressed and ended with reading her the same page of a mystery novel 3 times, because she couldn't hold the plot in her head anymore. I thought about all of that, and I looked at my sister, and I said the only thing I could think to say that wouldn't start a war. One didn't have the energy to fight in that kitchen on that night, with our grandmother 12 feet away. "Okay, Nicole," that's what I said. "Okay, Nicole." And I kept washing the dishes because somebody had to, and it clearly wasn't going to be her. I want to pause on that moment for a second, because I think a lot of you know exactly what it feels like. The specific, quiet violence of being told you're the problem by someone who has never once done what you do. If that's ever happened to you, if you've ever been the one who stayed and gotten called selfish for it, I want you to know something before we go any further. It wasn't you. It's never actually about you. It's about people who've never done the math. Grandma Jo died on a Sunday morning in February in her own bed, in the house she lived in for over 50 years, with me holding one hand and a home hospice nurse, a colleague I'd requested specifically, because I wanted someone who'd let me be a granddaughter for those last hours, instead of a nurse holding the other. It was, by every measure that matters in this work, a good death. Peaceful. At home. Surrounded. I want to be honest with you. For about 6 weeks after that, I wasn't thinking about money or wills or my brother and sister at all. I was thinking about how quiet the house was without her voice asking what was in the oven. Grief doesn't leave much room for anything else, and I don't think anyone should feel rushed out of that part. The letter from the law office arrived on a Thursday in April. Wesley and Nicole, through an attorney, were formally contesting Grandma Jo's will, specifically the portion leaving the house and the remainder of her savings, to me, with smaller sentimental bequests to them. Their claim, in the language of the filing, was undue influence. The legal theory that a vulnerable, cognitively impaired person can be manipulated by someone close to her into signing away property they wouldn't have given up with a clear mind. I found an elder law attorney named Priscilla. Odom through a co-worker whose own mother had gone through something similar. Priscilla had a small office above a hardware store in Montpelier, and a way of explaining things that never once made me feel stupid for not already knowing them. Undue influence claims are common in will contests, she told me. In our first meeting, sliding a legal pad across the desk between us. It basically means they're arguing your grandmother wasn't really the one making the decision, that you were. To beat that, we need to show she was of sound mind when she made this choice. That it was truly hers, and ideally, that it was properly witnessed and documented at the time. There was that word again, witnessed. Priscilla also explained something I hadn't understood until that meeting. That anyone who holds power of attorney for another person has a legal duty to account for how they used that authority, every dollar, every transaction, and that the estate, now that Grandma Jo had passed, had the right to formally request that accounting from Wesley. He's had control of her finances for almost 3 years, Priscilla said. If everything's clean, this is a formality. If it's not clean, this is how we'll find out. I didn't say anything right away. I just thought about unpaid electric bills I'd quietly covered myself out of my own reduced paycheck during months when Grandma Jo's account supposedly had plenty in it. I thought about the roof repair Wesley had mentioned once in passing 18 months earlier, and never again. Request it, I told Priscilla. All of it. I didn't know yet what we were going to find. I just knew, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color, that it was going to be bad. The accounting request took 11 weeks, 3 formal reminders from Priscilla's office, and 1 testy phone call from Wesley's attorney accusing us of harassing a grieving family, a phrase I found almost funny, given that I was the only person in that family who'd actually spent 3 years doing the grieving adjacent work of watching someone disappear in slow motion. While we waited, Priscilla's paralegal was going through the file Grandma Joe's original estate attorney had kept. Routine work. Pulling every document connected to the will. That's where they found it. Tucked into a manila folder behind the will itself. In an envelope marked, in my grandmother's increasingly unsteady handwriting. For whoever needs to read this someday. Not for Wren yet. For whoever comes after. Priscilla called me herself instead of having the paralegal do it. That told me something before she even said a word. Wren, she said, your grandmother left a letter. A codicil technically, an amendment attached to the will, explaining her reasoning. It's dated 14 months before she passed. It was signed in front of 2 witnesses, her neighbors apparently, and there's a note from her physician, dated the same week, confirming she was assessed as cognitively intact at the time. I need you to come in. I sat in Priscilla's office and read 4 pages of my grandmother's handwriting, some of it shaky, all of it unmistakably hers, and I am not going to pretend to you that I got through it without falling apart in a stranger's office chair. She wrote about the tuna casserole nobody ate. She wrote about the $12 in a savings account, and what it meant to her that I'd never once asked her for anything more than that. She wrote, in plain, unsentimental language, exactly why she was leaving the house and what remained of her savings to the granddaughter, who had given up her own apartment, her own insurance, and 3 years of her own life to keep her out of a nursing home. And she wrote something else, something that made the back of my neck go cold, because it meant she'd known, or at least suspected, more than she'd ever said to my face while she was alive. I'd like Wesley to explain, in front of somebody who'll write it down, exactly what managing my money has cost me. I have my suspicions. I don't have the proof. Wren will find it because Wren finds everything eventually. She just watches longer than people expect her to. I sat with that line for a long time. The accounting arrived from Wesley's attorney 6 days later. Pages of bank statements, transfer records, and a cover letter insisting everything was fully authorized and appropriate. Priscilla and I spread it across her conference table like a jigsaw puzzle, and within 20 minutes, the picture underneath it stopped looking anything like appropriate. I want to stop the story right here for a second, because I know some of you already have a feeling in your stomach about where this is going. And I want to sit with you in it for one moment before we keep going. Have you ever found out that the person everyone trusted with the money was the one person you should have been watching the whole time? If you have, I want you to comment one word for me below. And I think you'll understand exactly why once we get to that courtroom, witnessed, that's the word. Write it in the comments. I'll explain everything it means by the time this is over. Legally, and the other way, the way that matters more. Okay, let's go back to that conference table because that's where the real story starts. The bank statements told a story in numbers, which is its own kind of language once you learn to read it. Over 33 months, Wesley had paid himself what he'd labeled, in his own handwriting on some of the deposit slips, a management fee, $1,150 a month. An amount he had never discussed with Grandma Joe's other children, never disclosed to the estate, and never had any legal authority to award himself. $37,950, gone in monthly withdrawals that started 4 months after he got the power of attorney and never stopped. There was a single transfer of $19,200, dated the spring before her diagnosis, labeled roof, foundation repair, Millhaven property. I knew that roof. I'd lived under that roof for 3 years. It had never been touched. There was no invoice, no contractor's name, no permit filed with the town. Priscilla checked. Nothing. And there were the cash withdrawals. $8,800 pulled out in amounts under $1,000 at a time, over a span of 6 weeks, starting 4 days after Grandma Joe's neurologist appointment, where the word dementia first entered her chart. 37,950, plus 19,200, plus 8,800, $65,950. I stared at that final number for a long time. It was underlined twice on Priscilla's legal pad, the way Grandma Joe had taught me to underline the things that mattered. Wesley called me 2 days after his attorney would have told him we'd requested and received the full accounting. He didn't mention the numbers. He offered instead what he called a clean way to end this before it gets ugly for everybody. He and Nicole would drop the will contest if I agreed, in writing, to waive any claim to reimbursement for the 3 years I'd spent as Grandma Joe's caregiver, and if I vacated the house within 30 days. Think about what this does to the family. Dragging it into a courtroom, he said. Like the courtroom had been my idea. Like he hadn't been the one who filed the contest in the first place. People in this town still remember Dad's funeral. Do you really want them remembering you as the granddaughter who sued her own brother? It was, I'll give him this, a good line. It was the kind of line built to work on someone who cared more about how the town saw her than about what was true. 2 years earlier, it might even have worked on me. I'm not suing you, Wesley, I said. You're the one who sued me. I'm just the one who's going to show up. I'm not taking from this family, he told me on the phone, in a voice that had gone very calm and very final. The voice of a man who has decided he's the reasonable one in the room. I'm managing what's left of it. Somebody has to. I recognized the sentence the second it left his mouth. I was 8 years old again, sitting on a floor by a heating vent, hearing it for the first time. 32 years old, standing in my grandmother's kitchen, hearing it again. And this time, I understood exactly what it meant when Wesley said, manage. I didn't sign anything. I told him I needed to talk to my attorney, and I hung up before my voice could do anything I'd regret. 4 days later, a text landed in a family group chat that had been almost entirely dormant since the funeral. Wesley, Nicole, me, and Wesley's 20-year-old daughter, Callie, who was away at college in Burlington and mostly used the chat to send birthday emojis. This message wasn't for the group. You could tell from the first 4 words that it was meant for Nicole alone, and that Wesley's thumb had simply tapped the wrong name. Handled the transfer before probate locks the account. Moved some of it over before the vultures show up asking questions. Don't tell Ren. Not yet. She'll make it a whole thing. It sat in the group chat for 11 minutes before Wesley deleted it. 11 minutes was long enough. Callie called me that night. I hadn't heard her voice in almost 4 years. Wesley had quietly discouraged contact after his divorce from her mother. The same year he'd started managing Grandma Joe's finances. And I'd let the distance happen because I didn't know how to fight for a relationship with a teenager who wasn't mine to fight for. I have a screenshot, Callie said, and her voice was shaking in a way that told me this call was costing her something enormous. I don't know what it means exactly, but it didn't sound right. None of it has sounded right for a long time. Aunt Ren, I think I've been telling people a story that isn't true. I want you to hold on to that moment because we're going to come back to it. Not everyone who believes a lie is a liar. Sometimes they're just 20 years old, and they've never once been shown the receipts. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot for a long time after that call, before I could make myself drive home. I said something out loud to the empty passenger seat, quiet, like a prayer I wasn't sure yet that I believed. Love doesn't need managing, I said. It just needs showing up. I didn't feel brave saying it. I felt like a woman trying to convince herself of something before she had the proof to back it up. It would be weeks before I got to say it again somewhere it actually counted. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out, which gave Wesley plenty of time to do exactly what a man like Wesley does when he feels the ground shifting under him. He tried to change the ground. He and his attorney sent notice that, since the house was still technically part of the contested estate, I needed to vacate within 2 weeks for the property's protection during litigation, a request Priscilla told me. Flatly, had no legal teeth whatsoever, and existed purely to unsettle me before the hearing. I stayed, but Wesley showed up anyway on a Saturday afternoon, with a folder of paperwork and a tone that had lost all of its calm phone call reasonableness. I was in the kitchen, packing up some of Grandma Jo's things into boxes, slowly, carefully, the way you pack up someone's whole life when you're not ready to actually be doing it, when he came through the door without knocking. He'd never needed to knock in that house. None of us had. "You need to be out of here," he said, "before this goes any further. You're making this harder than it has to be." "I'm not the one who made it hard, Wesley," I said. I kept my voice level. Grandma Jo used to say that the angriest person in the room usually loses the room, and I'd spent 3 years watching her be right about things like that. He stepped past me toward the counter, gesturing at the boxes like they proved some point about me taking things that weren't mine. His arm caught the edge of the recipe box, the same dented, decades-old box, still sitting exactly where it had sat my whole life, and it went off the counter in one motion, cards scattering across the linoleum in a wide, fluttering arc. Nobody said anything for a second. The room just held its breath. I got down on my knees on that kitchen floor and started gathering the cards up one at a time, checking that none of them had torn, straightening the corners of a recipe for Sunday stew written in handwriting shakier than the one above it, which was shakier than the one above that. 3 generations, scattered across linoleum my grandmother had mopped 1,000 times. I didn't say a word to Wesley while I did it. I didn't need to. My hands did all the talking, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I watched something crack open on my brother's face. Not guilt, not yet, but something close enough to it that he looked away first. "I didn't mean to do that," he said, quieter. "I know," I told him, still on the floor, still gathering. "You never mean to do the thing you're doing. That's kind of the whole problem, Wesley." He left about 10 minutes later without the boxes, without another word about the eviction notice, and without looking at me again. I sat on that kitchen floor for a long while after his car pulled out of the driveway, the recipe box back on the counter. Every card accounted for and squared up neat, the way Grandma Jo always kept it. I called Priscilla that night, not to report an emergency. Nothing illegal had happened. Nothing that would move the case forward in any legal sense, but because I needed to say out loud what I'd felt kneeling on that floor, that I wasn't scared of him anymore, that watching him knock over the one object in that house that actually held our whole family's true history, and watching him not even notice what he'd done, told me something about how this was going to end. "He's going to say that sentence again," I told her, "in front of people. I don't know when, but he's going to say it because he believes it, and believing it is the only thing that's ever going to bring him down." Priscilla was quiet for a second. "Then let's make sure somebody's writing it down when he does," she said. "Before I tell you about that hearing, I need to go back one more time, not to my childhood this time, but to a single night, 10 weeks before Grandma Jo died, because I left something out, and it's the part that actually carried into that courtroom when she'd had a lucid stretch that evening, the kind the hospice nurses told me to treasure without expecting. A window where her sentences connected the way they used to, and she called me by my own name 3 times in a row without stumbling. We were in her bedroom, lamp on low, and she asked me to bring her the recipe box, of all things, even though she hadn't been strong enough to stand at a counter in months. She went through it slowly, card by card, her fingers moving over the handwriting like she was reading Braille instead of ink. When she got to the ones in my writing, the 41 cards I'd copied out as a kid, she stopped and held one for a long time. Sunday stew. The same card that would end up on the floor 2 years later. You always did write things down exactly right, she said, measurements and all. No shortcuts. You taught me that, I told her. I taught you that because paper outlives people's memory of what actually happened, she said, and her voice for just a second had none of the fog the disease really put in it. I've watched this family rewrite its own history more times than I can count, baby. Somebody always ends up the villain in a story they didn't actually live. I wasn't gonna let that happen to you. Not after everything. She reached over. It cost her something. I could see it in her shoulders, and put her hand over mine on top of the recipe box. I made sure you're witnessed, she said. Same as always. Whatever happens after I'm gone, there's paper that says the truth. You just have to be brave enough to read it out loud in front of people who don't want to hear it. I asked her, because I still didn't fully understand what she meant. She just smiled, the way she used to when she thought I'd figure something out on my own eventually, and squeezed my hand once. You'll know when it's time, she said. You'll know because it'll be the hardest room you've ever stood in. Walk in anyway. Write it down, baby. Paper remembers what people forget. Those were close to the last full sentences she ever said to me. She slipped in and out after that night, and 3 weeks later, she was gone. I thought about that night every single day for the 10 weeks leading up to that hearing. I thought about it getting dressed that morning, buttoning a blazer I'd bought specifically because it looked like something a person wears when they need to be believed. I thought about it walking up the courthouse steps. I walked into that courtroom carrying a folder of documents in one hand, and in the other, folded small enough to fit in my coat pocket, the Sunday's stew card. I don't know why I brought it. I think some part of me needed something of hers with me that wasn't paperwork, even though in the end, it was the paperwork that was going to save me. The judge held my grandmother's handwriting between 2 fingers like it might still be warm, and the whole courtroom went the kind of quiet where you can hear the radiator complaining in the wall. That's where I started this story. Now you get to see the rest of the room. 23 people sat behind me, neighbors, my brother's golf buddies, the woman from the diner who used to slip Grandma Joe extra pie, people who'd known my family for decades and had, for the last several months, been quietly fed a story about a granddaughter who'd wormed her way into a dying woman's good graces for a house and some savings. That was the story Wesley had built carefully, over years of being the reasonable one, the responsible one, the one everyone called first with good news. This courtroom was the room he'd spent his whole life curating an audience for. It was about to become the room where that audience finally saw him. Priscilla stood first. She kept her voice even, almost gentle, the way you'd explain something to somebody you didn't want to frighten. Your Honor, before we address the accounting, I'd like to enter into evidence the codicil discovered in the decedent's estate file, assigned. Witness letter dated 14 months prior to her passing, along with a contemporaneous note from her treating physician confirming she was cognitively intact at the time of signing. This was the shield. It had to go first. It had to close the door on the idea that anyone had ever needed to manipulate my grandmother into anything. Because you cannot argue that a woman was too confused to know her own mind while holding a document that proved, on paper, in her own handwriting, witnessed by 2 neighbors, and confirmed by her doctor, exactly how clear that mind was. The judge read part of it aloud. Not all of it, she said. Some of it was between a grandmother and her granddaughter, and didn't belong to the room. But she read the part about the tuna casserole nobody ate. She read the part about the $12. And when she got near the end, she paused, glanced at Wesley for exactly 1 second, and said she'd like to read one more line before we moved on to the financial matter. A small thing, she said, but she thought it belonged on the record before the numbers did. I'd like Wesley to explain, in front of somebody who'll write it down, exactly what managing my money has cost me. That was the delay. One breath, one sentence. Before the number everyone in that gallery was waiting for. I watched Wesley's jaw tighten. He didn't know yet how literally his mother's request was about to be honored. Priscilla moved to the accounting next. The sword. She read the figures the way you'd read a recipe, plain, exact, no theatrics needed because the numbers did all the work themselves. $37,950 in unauthorized monthly management fee. $19,200 for a roof repair that was never performed, with no invoice, no contractor, no permit on file with the town. $8,800 withdrawn in cash within 6 weeks of a dementia diagnosis. A total, Priscilla said, of $65,950, unaccounted for, unauthorized, and self-directed. During a period in which the accused held sole financial power of attorney over a woman later diagnosed with a condition affecting her capacity to detect or contest it. I stood up. I hadn't planned to say anything. Priscilla had the numbers. The numbers were the point, but something in me needed to be standing when I said it. You didn't lose me, I said, looking at Wesley for the first time all morning. You just never budgeted for me. That's all this ever was. I wasn't a burden on this family's books. I was the only line item you never had to write a check for. The gallery didn't make a sound. I could feel Nicole somewhere behind me, very still. That's when Wesley stood up. I want to tell you he stayed calm, the way he had on every phone call, every quiet threat, every carefully worded email for the last 6 months. He didn't. Something in him finally cracked, in front of the exact audience he'd spent his whole life protecting his image for, and his voice came out louder than anything that room had heard all morning. I don't take from this family, he said, nearly shouting it, one hand slapping flat against the defense table. I manage it. Somebody has to. Nobody else was doing it. Nobody else ever does anything. I earn the right to decide what's fair for this family. After everything The judge didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Mr. Trent, she said, under this state's power of attorney statute, what you just described, awarding yourself undisclosed compensation, executing an unauthorized and withdrawing cash shortly after your principal was diagnosed with a condition that impaired her ability to monitor her own accounts, has a legal name. It's called self-dealing. It's a breach of your fiduciary duty. You just told this courtroom, in your own words, that you did it on purpose and that you believed you were entitled to. I watched the word land on him. Manage. The word he'd built his entire identity around. The word he'd used to end every argument in our family since he was 16 years old, turned over in a courtroom and handed back to him with its real name attached. There was a small commotion behind me before the bailiff had to do anything about it. Callie stood up. She was crying, but her voice didn't shake, not once, the whole time she spoke. I have the message, she said, to the judge, to the room, to her father. The one he sent to the family chat by accident. I have the screenshot. I didn't want to believe it either. I spent 4 years believing the version of my aunt he gave me, and I was wrong. And I'm not going to keep being wrong just because he's my dad. Wesley didn't look at his daughter. I think that told the room everything it needed to know, more than any bank statement could have. I want to tell you something, if you're still watching this. I spent a long time in my 20s asking myself a question I never said out loud to anyone. Was it me? Was there something wrong with me? Something that made it so easy for the people who were supposed to love me to decide I mattered less. There was nothing wrong with me, or never was. There was something wrong with the math they were doing, and it took a courtroom, and a dead woman's handwriting, and a 20-year-old girl braver than her own father to finally prove it out loud. If anyone in your life has ever made you feel like the freeloader in your own family, for the crime of being the one who actually showed up, I need you to hear this next part, because it's the whole reason I'm telling you this story. Love doesn't need managing. It just needs showing up. That's what I told that courtroom once things went quiet enough for me to speak again. I said it looking at Wesley, but I meant it for every person in that gallery who'd been fed a version of me that was never true. And for every person watching this who's ever needed someone to finally say it about them too. I want to be clear about something, because it matters to me more than the money ever did. I don't blame that gallery for believing him for as long as they did. I don't blame the woman from the diner or the golf buddies or even, honestly, Callie, for years of believing a lie that was told to them carefully and repeatedly by someone they had every reason to trust. I blame the person who told it. The judge ruled from the bench 2 hours later. The codicil was upheld as valid. The will contest was dismissed. And the accounting, all $65,950 of it, was referred to the state's Adult Protective Services Division for further review, a process, Priscilla told me afterward, that could result in criminal charges for financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, or could result in nothing at all, depending on things neither of us could control. I didn't celebrate in that courtroom. I didn't look at Wesley again after he sat back down, hands shaking, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. You don't dance over somebody who's just been proven, in public, in front of everyone whose opinion he ever cared about, to be exactly what he always accused someone else of. I just gathered my folder and the Sunday stew card still folded in my coat pocket, and walked out of that courthouse into a March afternoon that felt, for the first time in almost a year, like it belonged to me. Here's where everybody ended up, because I think you deserve the full picture, not just the version that makes the best ending. Wesley resigned quietly from the small-town select board seat he'd held for 6 years, about 3 weeks after the hearing, before anyone could force the question. The Adult Protective Services Review is still open, as I'm telling you this. It might result in formal charges. It might result in a settlement, or nothing at all. These things move slowly, and I've made my peace with not knowing how it ends. Because for the first time in my life, my peace doesn't depend on his consequences. It depends on mine. Nicole never apologized to my face. She sent a text 2 months after the ruling that said she was processing a lot and hoped we could eventually get back to a good place. I haven't answered it yet. I might, someday. I'm not in a hurry. The woman from the diner found me at the grocery store in May and told me, unprompted, that she was sorry for ever repeating what Wesley told her about me, and that she'd been buying my grandmother's favorite pie every week since the funeral and setting a slice aside, out of habit, like Grandma Jo might still come in for it. I cried in the cereal aisle. I'm not ashamed of that. Callie moved in with me for the summer in Grandma Jo's house, in the room down the hall from the one I grew up sleeping in during those childhood summers. She's back at school now, studying social work, which feels like the kind of detail that would sound too neat if it weren't true. We talk every week. The recipe box lives on my own kitchen counter now, in the house that's legally mine, dented corner and all. 42 cards these days. I added one this spring in my own handwriting, for a stew I make every Sunday, the same one that ended up scattered across a kitchen floor the day my brother stopped pretending he hadn't already lost. I told Callie, before she went back to school, that I wasn't going to be her rescue plan, and I meant it kindly, not coldly. I told her I'd help her find a lawyer if she ever needed distance from her father on paper, that I'd always answer the phone, that I was proud of who she was becoming. But I also told her that when she's steady on her own 2 feet, really steady, not performing it for anyone, she should come find me as her aunt, not as a place to land. Family, not a bank. She cried a little. So did I. It felt like the healthiest goodbye I'd ever given anyone in this family. I think about my grandmother almost every day, usually in small moments, folding a sheet the way she taught me, watching a patient's hands instead of listening to their words, writing a recipe down exact, no shortcuts. Because paper remembers what people forget. That's still true. It was true when I was 10 years old, bored, wanting to go play outside. And it was true in a courtroom 32 years old, wearing a blazer bought specifically to look like someone who deserved to be believed. I keep the Sunday stew card in the same coat pocket most days now, out of habit more than need. I don't need it anymore. Not really. I know I'm witness. My grandmother made sure of that a long time before I understood what the word meant. And it turned out she'd been building my case for me since I was 8 years old on the floor by a heating vent, listening to my brother learn the wrong lesson about what it means to take care of people. If there's one thing I want you to take from all of this, it's not really about wills, or power of attorney, or courtrooms. It's this: if you're the one who stays, the one who shows up, the one who does the unpaid, unglamorous work of loving someone while everyone else finds a reason to be somewhere else, write it down. Keep the receipts, literally and otherwise. Not because you're building a case against your family, because you deserve, someday, to be believed without having to raise your voice to prove it. Love doesn't need managing. It just needs showing up. That's not a courtroom line anymore. That's just how I try to live now. And it's the only inheritance I actually needed. If this story reminded you of your own family, if you've ever been the one everyone else called selfish for, finally taking care of yourself, or if you've ever waited years for somebody to finally see what was right in front of them, tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss the next story. There are a lot of families out there doing bad math on the people who love them the most, and I plan on telling every version of the story I can find, one witness documented undeniable truth at a time. Thank you for staying with me all the way to the end of this one. I mean that more than you know.